Hello, Measure Masters. Welcome back to another Measure Master live training for the month of April, really. But we are here in May already because the month was too short and didn't foresee the holiday that was coming up. So we do it today. Hope you doing all right. We're gonna get started in 5 minutes. So if you watch this on a replay, we are probably gonna put some timestamps down below, so you'll be able to just jump into the presentation itself. We're gonna talk about debugging techniques today. So how you can debug your tracking. This is a topic that came up in the Measure Masters group, and so I wanted to talk a little bit about it. All right, before we get started, if anybody is live right now, can hear, can see me, give me a shout out in the chat functionality. We are also streaming live today to our Facebook group. So if you're on the Facebook group, let me know in the comments if you can see this and if you are watching this. I'm actually gonna go over to Facebook right now and see if we have a new post here, or if it doesn't work or it works. Let's see. So this is a new software that I'm using called Restream.io, and I will actually take my stream and put it into several platforms, but really just tried out Facebook and YouTube here, as it's something that works quite well for us because we are on these two platforms. I don't know if I should open up a Twitch account to live stream on Twitch. Let me know if anybody of you watches this on Twitch or would like to watch this on Twitch. Then we definitely could set something up. Okay, let me ask if everybody can hear me. We are also on Facebook. Looks a bit choppy. I don't know if that's normal or if it's just my computer, because I run everything through one computer, and yeah, I would need to get a 2 PC streaming setup at some point in order to make this a bit more cool. All right, everybody can hear me. Then we can just get started in a few minutes. Just 2 more minutes left. If you have any questions during this live stream, please leave them in the chat or the comments down below, because we'll be able to answer them after the presentation. I won't be able to take up on any questions during the presentation, as I'm going through the presentation and won't be able to do this at the same time. Cool. Let me just see if everything works here. If we switch over, should be all right. And we are almost at 10 a.m. here in Berlin. Now, it was interesting to think about this topic, debugging, because I do this as a very regular time, and it's not something that's very straightforward to answer, as oftentimes issues arise and we have different kind of bits of information floating around in our tracking deployment. In order to get them into a sequence and finding out the error actually takes a lot of time, practice, and knowledge about the processes. So I try to break it down and make it into a little bit of a framework for you guys, so you'll be able to follow along. But yeah, it's interesting to think about, because what I do on the group and on YouTube and so on is obviously taking questions from different people and then building a tracking deployment out of it. And I always show the best possible tracking deployment that affects most of the people. Like I do it on WordPress most of the times because most people have a WordPress website, but there could be so many things wrong in terms of the setup that I won't be able, if somebody says just my Google Analytics isn't working, there is no one single question I can ask or answer in order to get this fixed, because there could be so many hosts of problems. This was really interesting, putting this presentation together and thinking about like how can we make this into a framework that would be applicable for most of the people. So without further ado, let's get started. I think we have a few people watching, yes. And if you have any questions, please leave them in the comments down below. So let's get started. Welcome, Measure Masters, to this Measure Master live training for the month of April. We are live right now on Thursday and talking about the debugging techniques. Now I've asked in the Facebook group, like, what kind of topics do you want to hear about? And this really came out to me because it was one of the topics that I've been constantly thinking about as I answer questions in the Facebook community, but also through clients that I have and obviously the YouTube channel. So today I want to break it down a little bit for you on how you can debug your tracking deployments. On the research about this topic, I have actually Googled and tried to find out like debugging techniques for tracking, and I found an old video of mine 2 years ago, watched it. I must say it's pretty relevant still. So if you want to check that out as well, on the YouTube channel, we have a video on debugging tracking implementations. But today we want to talk about this, and I want to go into more detail so you learn something. Without further ado, let's get started with our little presentation, and I want to start with this picture. Probably some of you know it. It's the blue screen of death that sometimes happens on Windows. And it's kind of like a shock moment for me as well when I was still on the Windows machine a few years ago. You get the screen and you think, oh my God, my computer broke down. Will it ever be okay again? You have done something and suddenly it just crashes. Now, Windows over the last few years has made it a bit more friendly, so it looks like this now. But still, it is one of these errors that you sometimes encounter where you obviously don't know exactly what to do right away. And it's kind of like when you are in your car and it breaks down. What do you actually do? It's a highly complex machine that you are operating there. And when smoke comes out of the hood, what do? You might be inclined, first of all, to stop your car, but some people are just in despair and like, my car broke down. You might open the hood ledge and open the hood and look into it, but do you really know what you're doing there? Or you might just call for help. Now, in the realms of tracking, what do we do when a tracking deployment goes wrong, when we get an error? Well, there is the old technique of Googling. And if you ask developers, actual developers, of what they spend their time on, they're not all perfect and can write code from dawn till dusk, but rather they Google a lot because you run into problems. Now, this mindset of a programmer I find really interesting because there's a feedback loop always going on of trying things out and seeing if they work, if you get the expected output, if this is working correctly for you. I have my Google Home here in my room, and it sometimes goes off randomly on, obviously, live streams. Now, you have these problems, and you Google for them, and you go down the rabbit hole. And that happens quite often. You see different forum posts, you try out different tools that show you different errors, or scan your website and say, oh, this and this and this must be wrong. You watch maybe a video of mine and you're like, oh, this should be so easy, but it doesn't work for me that way. Or you ask a question in a forum, but even there, you would need to wait for an answer. And it might be something that takes you down another rabbit hole because there are more questions that come up. So as somebody on the receiving end of these questions, right, I answer them oftentimes in the YouTube comments, I as well need to be very patient with this to answer them. So as we become more and more a self-sustaining marketer, a self-sustaining implementer of tracking, isn't there a better way of doing things, of just randomly Googling and trying to find the error? Isn't there a more effective way? And obviously, yes, there is. It's called debugging. Now, debugging comes from is a term that's coined really by programmers. When the first programs were written, you obviously have a input that you put into the computer program and you get an output. And this is all these different rules that are written into a little bit of a computer code and too few lines of code. Sometimes the few lines are actually pretty big programs, and you are expected to get your output. So that is basically how a computer program works. But what if the output is not as expected, right? Where did things go wrong? And the unfortunate things about computer programs is that there are many different variables, many different cogs in a little tiny wheel that actually need to work together in order to get the output. And a good computer program obviously takes a lot of different inputs and gives you the expected output. Unfortunately, sometimes some things go wrong, and then a programmer needs to debug their implementation, their implementation. How do they go about doing this? And this is the process of debugging. It's really about the process, the tools that you use to actually look into the problem, and then testing. And this is what we want to cover today. So in our agenda today, I want to give you the process that I would think of when I go through a debugging process that you can also think about logically, so you don't panic and say, hey, what am I actually supposed to do? We'll talk about tools, obviously, and we will talk about testing. Then we'll go through some use cases, although there are so many out there that I wasn't really able to get good demos together. And I'm gonna give you some demo tips. And in the end, if there are any questions, then we'll answer them in our Q&A section. Sounds like a plan? Then let's get started. First of all, let's talk about the debugging process. There are 4 steps that I come up with here. First of all, you should define your input and your output, which is really what is your goal with this whole implementation? What do you want to have happened at the end of this? Then you go into defining the variables. This is really about a brainstorming process that really depends on your knowledge as well, to think of all the different steps that the program needs to run through, the tracking deployment needs to run through in order to get to the expected outcome. Then you sequence this all, so you put it into order, and yeah, that's something we're gonna go through in a second. And then you test and isolate the problem so you will be able to fix it. So let's go first through the input and the output. This is very important, so you will be able to actually think clearly about what you're doing. I always tell you, when you deploy tracking, to think about the end goal. What is something that you want to have in your Google Analytics account later? What is the data that should be picked up by Google Analytics or by Facebook or by any other tool that you want to send that data to? You have an input and an output where you would require to have certain steps in between in order to get this output. So thinking about this is very important. So for example, if the sentence is, I want to track the text of the button when the user clicks the button in Google Analytics with Google Tag Manager. This is not very specific, but at the same time, we can take out the right inputs and the outputs and say, okay, the event that we want to fire to Google Analytics, the input is the button click. And in the end, we want to go into our Google Analytics behavior reports and want to look for an event that with an event label where the button text appears. Now this process of defining the input and the output is all about replication, because if you have an error and you say something isn't working in my output, then you should be able to replicate it. So if I would tell you, okay, show me how I can replicate the error. Oh, okay, go to the page, click on the button, and then in Google Analytics real-time reporting, you see that the event value is undefined, for example, right? That is a replicable case for me to go through and see, oh, for me that works. So where's the problem? You wouldn't be able to replicate it. But if this is happening on your website, something isn't working correctly, I need to be able to replicate this. And if you can replicate it on a consistent basis, then you'll be able to tackle this problem head on, because something is going wrong in this process and we need to find out what it is. Next step then would be to brainstorm about the variables. So what actually goes into a tracking deployment? And this is not only about, oh, I set up a tag and a trigger here, but rather the process that works in the background. Unfortunately, you will need to have a little bit of knowledge and a little bit of experience in order to know this. That's why it is sometimes helpful to hire an expert, right? Or to ask for help inside of the Measure Masters community, where people like myself, but other experienced members as well, can ask you the right questions and give you the right process for you to debug. And for our example here, what goes in? But the tracking code fires, data gets sent over to Google Analytics, Google Tag Manager fires, there's a trigger that has a variable that it evaluates. It picks up something from the data layer and transfers it on. So you have all these different things floating around. But the most important part here is really that a tracking deployment, although you have these things happening at the same time seamlessly, and within 1 second the data gets sent over, there is always a sequence to things. There's always a step-by-step process that JavaScript, that the website, that the tracking deployment goes through in order to get to the end result. And sequencing these, although you might not have all the steps, is very important, so you'll be able to later look at these steps in detail. So for example here, it starts with the website loading. It starts with Google Tag Manager, then loads, then the analytics tool gets deployed through Google Tag Manager, then a click listener gets deployed, the data layer is there, you click on the element, it gets sent over to Google Analytics. In Google Analytics, it's processed, and then it's put into your reports, right? Any of these steps could be faulty. And obviously, I have written here multiple steps. There are even probably hundreds of more processes out there that are in between of these steps. So you wouldn't be able to write them all down, but having a little bit of an idea of like how would the sequence go is something that is very important for your next step, which is the testing and the isolating. Now, I don't want to get into this in this part because it's just about the process here. But the testing and the isolating would be to pick out certain things and then testing them and finding out if there's an error, if there's expected behavior or not. So again, the process really is about trying to figure out what is my input and my output, what is my end goal, what are the variables that go into it, how does it play out in the sequence. So think about the process of how the computer thinks or how the tracking deployment actually thinks, and then go into the testing and isolating of the problem in order to fix it. Now we want to talk about tools. Let me just take a sip here. Now, tools are very important for this process because at any point in our testing and isolating, you actually want to know when does a process has an expected output or something goes wrong, right? And debugging tools can help you to look under the hood. This is something that a lot of people don't realize because in Google Analytics, it all seems so easy, right? And in my videos, it makes it seem so easy. Oh, he just clicks these few buttons and then my data gets transferred. But in the end, they try it out and it's not getting transferred. And then you need to be able to look under the hood. And obviously, computer programmers look into their code in order to find out what is happening. We need to do the same into our tracking deployment. We need to look into each step in order to know where did this error happen. So what are tools that I would use for such a process, right? At the beginning, the website loads. We can see that in, for example, the Chrome developer tools. Data gets sent into, or Google Tag Manager does its processes, the Google Tag Manager debug console. Then data gets sent over to Google Analytics. We have the Tag Assistant to see this. And then data gets received by Google Analytics, and we have, for example, Google Analytics real-time reporting. So this, I must say, is very custom to the process that you go through. If you would send data over to Facebook, you obviously would need different tools in order to do this, although the beginning would be the same. Or if you debug a mobile app, you have different tools of doing things. So let me just briefly show you some tools that I oftentimes use. Here we are in our demo shop, and we already have one debug tool open here, the tag manager preview mode. But I want to show you a tool, and these are mostly extensions actually I use within the browser. And this is mostly for web tracking, obviously. So first of all, once the website loads, what happens in the background, data gets downloaded from the server. And the first document that gets downloaded from the server is actually the HTML code. We can look at this by going to view page source, a built-in feature by Google Chrome and most other browsers as well. So this is the initial code that gets downloaded. It's very interesting to see this because we can see what is hard-coded. So what is actually downloaded from the server by default. And we see here Tag Manager. We have here the plugin installed. Tag Manager is actually not installed because I have this extension running that's injecting it. But if I would look for Google Analytics, right? Google Analytics has a library called ga.js or analytics.js. You could also have segment.js, right? Where is this tracking coming from? Something that I might want to debug. Once the website loads, I actually also use a developer plugin or extension for Google Chrome, which is called redirect path. And this shows me where did the website get its information from and where was I redirected. Sometimes there are things happening weirdly with the query string in the end, UTM parameters, where you get redirected over and over again and information gets lost, right? And so what is the redirect that is happening here? So if I would just go over and put in Versicherung here, which is the German term for insurance, and I click on this result, the website obviously loads, and there are redirects happening in the background because we're going through different ad servers sometimes, right? So here we are on the page, and now we can click on this extension, and we can see, oh, we were actually redirected 3 times before we hit our goal here. So first of all, we went through Google's ad server, then the Google Ad Services, which is Google ad click. And then we went to IntelliAd, which is a bid management software. So something to look at. And I don't think that's inherently bad that you have redirects, but sometimes you look for errors and you find out, oh, the website loads. So actually the first step that we went through here, the website loads, but I don't get the expected outcome. So maybe it's a redirect issue. So then the website loads, and we can look into the loading process actually by going into our developer tools here and going to the network tab. And in the network tab, if we reload the page again, we get all this kind of information about what documents get downloaded. Unfortunately, this takes a while just because I have a lot of different programs running here. Maybe I should also close this website. So here you see there are a lot of different things that get downloaded, JavaScript, CSS. All of these are really just variables that make up a website, but also a tracking deployment. So there might be tools, JS codes that are conflicting with your code. And that's why it's also important to look into the console, which is really the JavaScript environment. And sometimes we see errors here. Unfortunately, we don't see an error right now. This is all debug information. But sometimes you see errors here. Oh yeah, there was one error when we go to a product. You see errors that actually prevent your codes from executing correctly. And this is oftentimes if you have a custom HTML tag and you write custom JavaScript in there, you might have an error. So for example, here, we could get an error, failed to load resource 404. So something couldn't be downloaded from the server. You can actually look here, it's Google Plus, it's the Google Plus plugin. Google Plus was shut down a month ago, I think. So yeah, that API doesn't exist anymore. So get an error. Now this doesn't have anything to do with your tracking deployment. It's not inherently bad, but I would look into this. And sometimes developers also like have conflicting JavaScript that then stops the website from functioning correctly. And you would need to look into this as well. Now you can also look into the sources. So this is actually, once I clicked on this JavaScript thing, it took me to the sources panel where I can inspect and see the different stuff that was downloaded and where the error actually occurred. So that might be something that you want to look in as well. Now the network tab actually gives us also the flexibility to say, oh, maybe my Google Analytics or my G tag doesn't work correctly, so I want to block it next time, right? So I have an error here. Fortunately, well, at the end, isn't there an error? No. So sometimes you have an error here and you say, okay, here is a GTM 4WP, so our plugin is putting out a JavaScript, and we can block this request URL. So now it's blocked, and once we reload the page, we might get other information. And this is, again, in a testing process, this might be very interesting with this tool to go through. Okay, moving on, the developer tools, very, very good tool set in order to look at this. And then we move on to our tracking deployment. So once we are in Google Tag Manager, obviously, we can always do different things within Google Tag Manager, but then also the tool of the preview and debug mode, which you can activate here. Now the preview mode gives us a lot of information about the data layer, the actual events, the variables that get triggered by the events, and then the tags itself. And you can actually, and this is something that a lot of people don't do, once you click into a tag, you can see the firing trigger options, why a trigger fired or why it didn't fire. So in this case, the event rule wasn't met, and also the click text rule wasn't met. So something to look into if your tags don't fire. Moving on, then we have a lot of extensions that actually give us information about sending data over. And tools that I use a lot, really, a lot, is the Facebook Pixel Helper for Facebook events. So if you have a Facebook event firing, or also the GA debugger. Now the GA debugger gives us a lot of information and it logs data into the console, the JavaScript console. So we can see here what data was sent over to Google Analytics. Very helpful for really a tool to look under the hood and see what should be sent over here and why isn't this data getting sent over. So if I configured something in my tag deployment, but it isn't met or it isn't shown here, then we might have done something completely wrong. So really important to look at this as well. Moving on, we have tools such as the Analytics Pro extension, which debugs more and gives you some warning messages. So here you can see this is very helpful if you want to see what is pushed to the data layer, for example. I haven't used it too much, but yeah, recently it came up more and more, and people asking me about some error messages that came up here. Now you might be also asking about am I using the tag assistant? I have it installed because it's easy to see and it's visually appealing, and Google tells you to use it. I don't think it's the best extension for debugging Google Analytics, although it has some feature sets here, But a lot of people are complaining about why is this blue and why isn't this green? It should be green, right? I get this green thing on the G tag. Why don't I get a green thing on the Google Analytics or so? It doesn't really tell anything, because in the end you need to look into your tool if the data is received, and we'll go through this in a second. Another tools that I use here are for debugging the data layer. The data slayer actually gives you quite good information, especially once you move on to the next page. It keeps this information available, and you'll be able to see, once we are moving on, the data layer information that you had on the last page view, for example. So here's the next page view, and we can see what data layer information. So even if you are moving on from a button click and you still want to look into the preview and debug mode, or in the data layer at least, you can see that in this data layer. Then we have a extension by David Fagello, or David, and he has developed this with enhanced e-commerce tracking in mind. So if you have enhanced e-commerce tracking deployed, you would be able to see in this extension, and this is all inside of the Google developer tools, debug information not only about the different pushes, but then also the enhanced e-commerce. Well, did I go to the right? It should send information about enhanced e-commerce tracking over. Don't know why it doesn't do it now. But if you have enhanced e-commerce tracking installed, then you should get information about enhanced e-commerce tracking. So you can actually look at the hits that are getting sent, and the information that gets sent over to Google Analytics in a more friendly way to see it, actually, because it is kind of hard to read through it. Now, all of these tools, what they do, they sniff out whatever gets sent over to Google Analytics. And you could do this kind of manually as well, right? So when you know what happens in the background of Google Analytics, you could actually also go to the network tab here and look for the Google Analytics hits. So I think it's here we have the collect call, and this is to Google Analytics. You can see when we click on it in the header information, there is certain things encoded in it. So DT stands for title, I think. Yeah, document title stands for document title. So this gets sent over to Google Analytics. Obviously, it's nicer to look at this in the information that gets sent over to Google Analytics here with the preview and debug mode. And the right extension. But this is what the extension actually does. It just passes what gets sent over and puts it into a debug panel here. Oh. Yeah, mostly these are the collect calls that actually get sent over. So this is something you could also look at. Did I forget anything? Oh, WASP. WASP is an extension that I often use in order to see where was tracking deployed from. So this is a question that sometimes comes up when there are multiple Google Tag Manager containers or G tags or multiple hard-coded things installed. Any of these could deploy multiple other tracking code. So it's sometimes hard to actually visualize and trace back where did this come from. So if we have, for example, a Facebook tag here, right? Let's see, facebook.com, Facebook event. Where did this Facebook event originate from? And we can see here that it originated from Google Tag Manager.js, and Google Tag Manager.js actually also deploys analytics and debug information and so on. So you have an origin, and you can look through where did this actually come from. Something that's useful once it comes to problems on that step where you want to look. Last but not least, once the data gets sent over, it's very important, you need to also be able to see your end result within the tool itself. The tools that I use for this is oftentimes the real-time reporting for Google Analytics. And this obviously depends on which data you send over. Google Analytics has the real-time reporting. Very cool to see hits coming in and see what data is attached and how Google Analytics handles this. But it doesn't replace what Google Analytics does in the background with the information about processing, right? So Google Analytics has a lot of processing going on once the hit enters, and everything that is attached to a session, for example, in Google Analytics, is something you won't be able to see in the real-time reporting because the session isn't over while you're sending stuff over. What you can then do, also very helpful, is to go into the User Explorer report. Now, inside of the User Explorer report, you'll be able to see sessions and session. Let me just go back here because the account doesn't have any information. So here you have the client ID, and inside the client ID, you can actually click and see different sessions and what they have done. Very important when it comes to breaking of sessions. So a user goes through a page and the session breaks. That's something you would be able to look up. Where does a session actually break? So for example, here we have a demo blog, and then the user goes over to the demo shop. Although it should be in one session, it starts a new session. Why is that? Cross-domain tracking issue, for example. Something you could look into with the User Explorer report. And these are the tools that I really use. Obviously, you would also look into the end report that needs to be correct in the end. In Google and Facebook, I love the new tool that they have put out, which is real-time, test your real-time events. No, your events in real time. So you can go to your, where is this actually? You can go to your account, your ads account, then you can go to data sources, and where did I click here? How do I get back? You need to click into the pixel that you have installed, and then you can go to test events. This will put your pixel into a special mode. So when events come in, you'd be able to see them right away and see what data gets transferred. Great for debugging information within Facebook. That doesn't mean that you can really look into attribution, because attribution is something that goes in the background and you wouldn't be able to see how Facebook handles that. Okay, let me just put this one back in. My energy just almost went off. So always look at the tools that you want to send data to and see what they have on their receiving end. I also have this information here from Bing, for example. Bing has a helper tool. Obviously, that's something you would like to use. Or if you are using Firebase for mobile debugging, Firebase also has a debug window, so to say, within the suite itself, that will let you see the stream of users that come in. But you need to put your app actually into a special mode, and then, which is the debug mode. So here we have the debug view, and here you would be able to see a stream of events if you put your device in a special debug mode, which is obviously something that developers would do, but maybe you don't have actual access to the user base itself. You can't look into the code itself. So what you could do is they also have some kind of real-time reporting where you would be able to look at if you are on the app right now and are using it, you could be tapping into this and seeing what are the events that actually come through. Many tools available, and if you have any questions for a tool or for a special, how can I see certain things? This is actually the first question that should go through your mind. You should be asking yourself, okay, I have this problem, but how can I actually see the requests that are coming through? How can I see if cross-domain tracking works? What are the best tools in order to see debugging information about this specific thing? Then you might want to see if there are tools out there that can actually help you out. Testing. Testing is really the meat of what you will be doing in debugging. And this is all about running little tests. Like in a laboratory, you need to do it over and over again in order to get to an end result where you can find the bug. Sometimes it's faster, sometimes it's slower. But it's also like, you might know testing from A/B tests. So A/B test is also something, if you want to increase the conversion rate, you don't run one test and say, oh, we make the button green and that's it. You run tests over and over again in order to get closer to the end result of increasing the conversion rate. And a good testing program actually has a design of multiple tests. But before you actually get started, you look at your sequence again of things that you want to test, and you make up kind of a, I would say, a roster of or grouping of things. So for us right here, it would be, this is all happening on the website and this is happening in Google Analytics, right? Now let's look at a test where we can first determine, should we look at the website, something is going wrong on the website, or should we look at what is going on inside of Google Analytics? Because Google Analytics has a lot of processing through filters and so on. So maybe that's the problem. And you can look into one or the other area and try to find out where something is happening. Now what you do is come up with a hypothesis, and then you test this hypothesis, and you really just pick out one of the points here from our sequence, and you come up with a hypothesis. Now first of all, I need to talk again about test design. Like in A/B testing, we don't want to expose our test to this wrong environments where we just let all traffic run through it, but we want to have something comparable. So be aware of the environment that you put this in. Is this on a mobile device or is this on a Chrome browser? The steps that you go through. So these are the steps to replicate it, and you will need to do this in your tests correctly. This is also something that I actually, when I think about implementing for a client, I always ask them, like, how can I actually test this if your checkout is behind a checkout bar or how do you call this? A payment gate, right? How could I test this? Should I use my credit card? Do you give me a credit card? Do you have a special mode? Do you have a special a coupon code that I could use? Very important. Then you go through and come up with a hypothesis and your expected outcome in the end. Then you choose one of these points. Now, as you saw earlier, we have grouped this into what is happening on the website in Google Analytics. And the easiest way to build then a decision tree of saying, where should I look at? Should I look at the website or should I look at the Google Analytics side? You devise a test and say, okay, let's look if the data actually gets sent over. And this is what we do here in step 9. The tracking code sends data to GA. Okay, hypothesis is GA doesn't transfer the correct data or doesn't transfer the data at all. Let's test this. Let's click on the element and see if this actually happens. And there are different tools out there. Again, debugging tools, very important to see if information gets sent over. And then you come up with a decision tree where you really run tests. You say, okay, this worked, this didn't work, and you come up with an insight, a learning from that, and run the next test. And debugging is really about running these micro tests over and over again. What could we test in order to see if something is happening or not? And hopefully you will then get to the right result where you say, okay, this test actually showed me that something is wrong with the variable, and therefore I would need to look into the variable and hopefully fix the bug through that. So let's go through some use cases here in order to show you this. First of all, an undefined value. So let's say I wanted to track something in Facebook Analytics, and we already done this actually. We clicked on the element and we get a click text undefined value. Now, there are hundreds of reasons why this actually would be happening, right? We can already rule out some of those. Does the data get sent to Google, to Facebook? Yes, it does. Actually, it gets sent via the Facebook pixel, so this gets picked up. The event is picked up correctly. Now, if it gets sent, so it wouldn't be something that is within Facebook going wrong, but rather when we send the data over. Now, how is this data actually deployed? It's deployed through Google Tag Manager. So we have the debug console here, and we can look at the tag itself. So we would need to choose the right event. So page event, we have the Facebook pixel, and we obviously clicked on the event. And here we have our Facebook event, and we can see that track custom and click text is undefined. Why is this undefined? This is something we would need to find out. Well, let's go into Google Tag Manager and look into the tag itself. Facebook button click here. And we see it has a variable called DLV button click text. Okay, fair enough. Now, once this click happens, we want to look into the variables and see how they are resolved. We see DLV button text is undefined. So somebody has set up a variable, that was me, to see, to pull the button text out of the data layer. Let's look at the variable itself. So you see, we're getting through a process of getting closer to the actual result. And here we have a data layer variable name button text. That doesn't really make sense because the data layer normally doesn't have a variable or a key called button text. So obviously it was wrong implemented, and we can actually look into the data layer and see here that we have no, we don't actually have button target. We don't have anything in the data layer, but Google Tag Manager actually gives us already a built-in variable called click text. So why don't we use that? So our tracking deployment is faulty because we used a wrong variable. And so I'm going to use a different variable here. And this variable will be DLV, click text. This is our default variable. Let's save this. And again, this is why you have your replicable process. You go through it again and again. You have changed something. You changed a little variable here. And now we want to try this out again in order to see if this works. Unfortunately, it loads a bit longer. So I'm going to click on my add to cart button. And we have our click here. And let's go into Facebook. We have a click event. And this time we see the click text was add to cart. So now it's working as expected and we can deploy this again. This is just a very small example to see undefined values. Where do they actually come from? How is my thinking process when I need to debug something like this, right? Obviously, if you are a bit more experienced, you would probably right away jump to the conclusion. There must be something wrong with the variable. What variable is deployed in this? Oh, okay, I see the error right away. I can fix it. You don't even have to go through the whole exercise of writing down and trying to look through the problem and coming up with different experiments and hypotheses. But this is really what is going on in the background anyways. So I might as well give you the process, the rundown of how to do it. Okay, let's talk about direct traffic. So sometimes people come up to me and ask me, hey, I have a lot of direct traffic in my analytics account. So if I go to our demo account here, I have a lot of direct traffic. Now, direct traffic is very, very hard to, or not very hard. There could be an easy reason. There could be a hard reason. So how would I go about this, right? Now, direct traffic, what is direct itself? Direct traffic is something that is within Google Analytics, but it's, go to acquisition here. It's something that is calculated through the session. So it's something that's heavily influenced by the processing of Google Analytics. Either in Google Analytics something could go wrong, might be that you have a filter installed, or outside something goes wrong. Might be that you don't have cross-domain tracking set up, might be that you have no UTM parameters, right? So we would define the input and the output for our problem and say, okay, I would send a user via UTM parameters, but then in the end he end up as direct none. How can that be? This is our replicable process that we can go through and actually test. Now, what I used to do in Google Analytics, normally I would look at this direct traffic and I would try to figure out one user ID where I can actually find where the user came from. And I would look at especially the landing page, because the landing page tells me where did the user land and what did he have attached to his query strings and where did he come from. So here it might be this website that gets a lot of traffic, and normally this should be PPC traffic or Facebook traffic, but it's all in the direct none column, right? Now what I would do is then test this. I would go to the website, and this is just hypothetically right now. I would enter the website through UTM parameters, so through my .utm test. Oops. Now we have 2 question marks. So through a UTM parameter, and then I would look into my session ID or client ID. This is something you can see within your developer tools with the GA debugger turned on. So you know we get all that information. Here we see the client ID, and this client ID needs to remain the same in order for our session to be stitched together correctly. So if this changes at any point, then there might be a problem on the website. And this is where I would go through and click through my click path that I hopefully have defined beforehand and try to find out where is the actual problem here and does the session change at some point. In the end, once I have this client ID, we go back here again. I would wait for a while, maybe take half day off and go over to your Google Analytics and then go into the User Explorer report, where you can find all the different client IDs and can click on them. Again, this is hypothetically because we can't do it right now. And see, oh, this user has 13 sessions, although that should just be 2. What did this user come and do on our page? And here we can see we had all these different interactions within his session. And therefore, I would like to find out, or this would give me an indication at least, if there's a session breaking somewhere, what the landing page was, and why this doesn't get transferred. So this could be one of the ways to combat direct traffic or see where something went wrong on the first view. I hope this gives you a little bit of an indication of how you would be able to debug this information, because you thought logically about how Google Analytics would process the information. Well, it's in a session, so the client ID needs to stay the same. How you would be able to see this, and then how you can infer from these session reports where something would break, if this is actually the case. All right, let's move on to the next case, mobile debugging. Not something that I'm very experienced with, I must say, because I mainly work on websites. But how would a debugger go ahead if you have a client that has Firebase or Google Analytics installed? there's actually no way to, or in Google Tag Manager at least, to open something up like the preview and debug mode, to install a little extension on your Chrome. There's no on your Android and say, oh, this is all the information that I get on the web, because it just fundamentally works differently. On mobile, we have a, do I still have my emulator open here? No. On mobile, we actually have a compiled code inside of an app that doesn't work in the browser itself. So tracking requests that get sent over work completely different. They sometimes get batched because obviously the user might be offline and using your app. And the information that gets encoded inside of the tracking deployment is something that the developer obviously oftentimes puts in, and not the marketer itself. So with Google Tag Manager, it's very, very hard to come by information. What I can recommend in that case would be a tool called Charles. You can download this for Mac. There's also a tool for Windows called Fiddler, where you can actually see network requests. So I'm going to open this up right here. And yeah, I just have the free trial right now. But once you buy this tool, you can connect it and will actually show you all the different requests that go through your computer at this time. So anytime I reload a website or do anything here, I would be just like in our report that we saw earlier inside of our network report in our developer tools. This is something that works outside of the program actually, and we can see here the different requests that come through. Now you also see a little log here, and this means that it's SSL saved. So when we look at this request here to Google, you can look at the contents, but the content is all scrambled because it's going through HTTPS. And obviously this end-to-end encryption, so you wouldn't be able to sniff out this, this network traffic. Now what we're doing here is actually just like a man-in-the-middle attack. We sit between the actual request and Google Analytics. So we can look at the packages that go through this. This is something that you would normally not do in web tracking because we obviously have all these great tools available. But when we can look at the source code of a mobile app, we could open up such a tool. And I don't have a good example for you right now, but what you can do is set up a proxy. So you could set up in your computer to send out a Wi-Fi signal that you can connect your phone to it, right? And on your phone, you'd then open up the app and do, you connect it obviously to that Wi-Fi hotspot that you open up through your computer. And then you would be able to see all the network requests that go from the phone to through the Wi-Fi on your computer, and they also send information to the tracking tools. Then you'd be able to look at these network requests. Now, if there's SSL encryption, you would need to also install a certificate which Charles provides you, and you would be able to then see what information gets sent over to this app. So for example, here we get our, we get here our information, and here we see UTMC. These are all cookies that get sent over. We should also be able to see our, normally it's under contents. So you see, I'm way over my head here right now. The funny thing is, it should give us some information about demo shop. So you see there are a lot of network requests because I'm live streaming. And so here we have demo shop. So it connects to our demo shop, but it should also connect to our Facebook. Yeah, it connects to Facebook here. And it should also connect to Google Tag Manager. Okay, we get too much information here. So it can get quite, you can put in filters and so on, but it's actually something that is sometimes quite overwhelming. Google Tag Manager. So here we get a Tag Manager request and it downloads the container. Here we get another Google Analytics request. Debug information. Plugins. Here's the collect call. So here we should be able to see no. Okay. Anyways, just like I told you before, we can take that collect call here and see what information is encoded in that string. And this is also something we could do for mobile requests. So we could see what is sent over and going back between an app on your mobile phone if you have it connected to your computer and such programs such as charts. You would need to set this up, and this is a bit more tedious process than I'm making it out to be here. But if you do mobile app tracking, that is something you would need to look into. Now, with apps itself, you obviously could also install the Android Developer Studio and get a app version sent over from the developer, so you'd be able to look into code itself. If you're a developer, you would maybe be able to read this. You can put your Android device into a special mode, so you'd be able in Firebase, for example, to see that information as well. So yeah, these are my thoughts on mobile app tracking. It's definitely not what we have on web, and it's harder to debug. So these are my 2 cents on that. Rogue referral on SBAs, this is just one problem that I have encountered once, and I definitely recommend to look through the blog post from Simo Ahava. The rogue referral problem is a very interesting problem when you have a single page application where the page view obviously doesn't reload. Now, a lot of people send virtual page views at that point in time, but what it can happen is that it actually overrides what gets sent over when you have Google AdWords requests coming in. So the GCLID, that's something that is very hard to debug, and found Simo somehow figured it out, and then you have to put in a special tracking in order to stop this kind of rogue referral program. What happens is actually that the Google Analytics when a request comes in from Google AdWords, you obviously have the GCLID. So Google Analytics would be able to say, oh, this user came from AdWords. But what happens on the next page view, which isn't really a next page view, the document referrer isn't there anymore. Or no, the document location isn't there anymore, and therefore, well, it stays the same. And therefore, this gets overwritten with Google information again, and then Google thinks the user actually came from organic, so it rewrites that information in your Google Analytics. Very annoying problem that I also wouldn't be able to figure out, but luckily there's a guide by Simo, so definitely look this up if you're interested in that. Okay, we have already reached almost our hour here. Oh yes, our hour here. So I want to go into quick bonus tips. Plan your testing, right? I always tell clients, give me a credit card so I can test the checkout. This is an annoying thing that you always have to do, is like testing a checkout over and over again. But this is actually the work of a debugger, of an implementer. To fix a problem, you would need to look into it, and you would need to have a way to do this. So right away, plan this out. How could I actually test this? Oh, I need a credit card, or I need a coupon code. Ask the client to give it to you. Next, replicate the problem with less variables, right? On your website, you might have not a standard implementation of WordPress. You have so many variables that come into play. So maybe set up your own WordPress website. We actually now provide this for our Measure Masters. So if you are a subscriber to our Measure Masters program, you get, where is this? Didn't I open it earlier? You get a demo shop if you go to our resources. And I've just opened this last week. So you can now get the exact replica of our demo shop by clicking on your sandbox button here. And this will actually generate a WordPress instance for you that you actually also have access on the backend side. So you can implement whatever plugins, and that way you can build a controlled environment with different plugins. Maybe there are different plugins at play, and you can test your implementation with a way less heavy system without any baggage on that side. So here we go. We have now a WordPress installation that you have access to, which is your completely, you have access to for 7 days. So this is your completely open WordPress platform that you can now utilize. Third, what you can also do with such a platform, you can see what is the expected output. So build your tracking deployment in and say, what should I actually see when I send over that data in my preview and debug mode or in my GA debugger? You can see, oh, I should see that the user has sent over this information. Why don't I see this on my other testing case, right? So you have the expected outcome, and you can infer it from there to see what you want to test. Next up, cross-check. Yeah, cross-check. So when you are dealing with orders, for example, maybe there's a secondary data source that you can look into in order to see where's the level point. So for example, a lot of my clients say, well, Google Analytics is not quite accurate. We have 50% more orders. Okay, how can we test this case? We would look into Shopify or into the backend of their shop system and see where, how many orders were actually generated. That way, we would be able to put this into the context and test for this and see where something went wrong. So always see if you have a secondary data source that you could set up. Could also be a secondary tracking tool. So Facebook Analytics and Google Analytics is already probably running on your website. Then debug your tracking. This is something when you want to set up a secondary source and send over certain values. I have made a video some time ago about use Google Sheets as a tracking tool. So you can send up a debug tool, so to say, a debug tracking tool that would then send information to your Facebook, to your sheet. So you have it logged into your sheet. This might be something that you want to utilize, especially when you are not quite sure where or you can replicate the problem, right? Okay, every time a user comes onto this page, sometimes it's happened, sometimes it doesn't happen. So maybe you build a trigger for when this case actually happens and you would send that information to Google Sheets. It's definitely not something that you could put into with thousands and millions of page views, but just for certain events, maybe you can set this up and say, okay, I get this information in here, and now I see more debug information than in my Google Analytics. For example, a Google event only has 3 or 4 fields that you could fill, right? The category, label, action, and the value. Now, if you wanted to send more information over, for example, the client ID or the time of day or the weather information, maybe you put this into your event logger, into your sheet there, and then you have it available later on so you can cross-reference it to Google Analytics and find out the error. Then a big friend of when you look at Google Analytics is segments as well. Segments are slicing of data. Utilize segments so you can really find out where did my data go wrong. And in my experience, sometimes I've worked with clients that say, oh, sometimes my orders don't get tracked, right? and you look into what data they already have available, and you cross-reference this maybe with the offline data that they have, not offline, but in their Shopify backend, for example. And then you find out, okay, this and this and this data wasn't actually inside of Google Analytics. Maybe I can find out where did these users go, so I could segment and find out certain segments. Oh, these users actually come from that traffic source, they use this device, and then they don't get picked up. Oh, okay. Why is that? Well, maybe I had a client once that configured their PayPal backend incompletely, and PayPal didn't get tracked. Although the user paid via PayPal, the order was generated in the system, but then the user was never sent back to the page itself, and therefore it was never tracked by Google Analytics. And obviously then the tracking doesn't show up in Google Analytics. Just one example. Use segments to slice and dice your data until you get to that point where you get a little bit of insights in order to know where to debug. Then don't forget compatibility. There are different devices out there, but there are also different browsers out there. And sometimes tracking works differently on different browsers. Google Tag Manager helps us a lot with certain tracking scenarios, because it writes in the background pretty good code that is already compatible with a lot of these different browsers that are out there. But if you find out through your segmentation, for example, oh, this error only happens when somebody comes from a Safari browser. Why is that? You test this on Safari. Now, Safari is another new thing with the ITP 2.1. They actually brought out ITP 2.2 just now. That the tracking differs from the other browsers. And that's something you need to take into account, definitely. And then devices, as you know, a Android device is different from an iOS device, from a website itself. All right, that is it with our little presentation. I will see if there were any questions. Unfortunately, we didn't get any questions beforehand. I think because I kept the topic a bit loose, and nobody knew what to ask questions about. And it's not very specific in saying we are going to do Shopify or whatever. So maybe this will be quite short. Let me look into the chat right now. We have Ricardo here. Hey, Ricardo. Yes, he says the Charles tool seems very good. That I don't really use it too much anymore. At the beginning, so when I started working with Google Analytics 10 years ago, it was the only tool out there, basically. So you'd be able you wouldn't have the developer tools to see all the network requests and so on. There was no GA debugger, no tag assistant. So there was an abstraction of like the network requests. So you would be able only to look into Charles or to Fiddler and see what data actually gets sent over. And I agree. Like when I look at Charles and when I look at Charles or Fiddler, it makes it seem very complicated because you're looking at the network request. But this is the basic thing that all of these different extensions now are built on. Okay, cool. I didn't get any questions here on Facebook as well. So I hope if you'd like to get any answers on the contents of what I was talking about, then please leave me a comment, and I'm definitely up for answering them in the comments or later on. As always, you will find also a timestamped version if you're just tuning in or just seeing the end here, like Ricardo. Then you'd be able to get information on the video as well down below, and then you can click on to one or the other sections. But we'll do this at a later stage today. So yeah, that will be there for your convenience. Cool. I think that's it for today. So thanks for tuning in. I've been talking for an hour, so my throat is a little bit tense right now. Should do some exercises beforehand, so I'll be able to keep this up a little bit more. That's it for another Measure Masters live training. Everybody who has joined me, thank you for tuning in, and I hope to see you next time. If you have any questions, again, leave them in the comments. That's it for now. My name is Julian. Till next time.